Welcome to our lecture on Jainism. Jainism, along with Buddhism, serve as two traditions that originated in the 6th century BCE, and they really were a revolt, a revolution against some of the orthodoxy that was taking place at the time. They were revolting against the traditions of Hinduism, particularly the old ways captured in the Vedas, the older parts of the Vedas in particular, and the caste system. So both Jainism and Buddhism originated in this 6th century BCE, and they both reject the Vedas and the caste system. Jainism comes from the term Jina, Jina, and it means victor over passions. When we talk about the Chinese religions, traditions that originated in China, there too we find that the 6th century, before the Common Era, was a time of change. Both Confucianism and Taoism begin in that century. You might have heard of Siddhartha Gautama, who became the enlightened one known as the Buddha, and started the tradition known as Buddhism. Less well known is the tradition of Jainism, and its founder, or greatest figure, who is named Mahavira. We don't know how long he lived. He was born around 599 BCE and lived until about 527, perhaps even until 467. Because this was so long ago, we can't be exact about the numbers. There were actually 23 figures that preceded Mahavira and served to forge his pathway. They were called the Tirthankaras, meaning crossing builders. So they serve as a bridge between the ways of old, Hinduism, and something new, Jainism. Also, the 23 serve as a bridge between the life of suffering, the cycle of reincarnation, birth, life, death, rebirth, bridging into enlightenment. So the bridge between life and nirvana or moksha. There are a lot of similarities between Mahavira and Siddhartha Gautama. We know they're born about the same time. They both had families, got married, and had a child. Mahavira has a daughter, Siddhartha a son. They both were born into extravagant wealth. They had very wealthy parents, and both resided in northern India. Here are some other similarities. And if you talk to scholars, it's unclear if these figures were actually the same person, or if they coincidentally just led similar lives, or if no one like them actually existed, and it was just a mythology that got parsed up between two different religions, Jainism and Buddhism. They both were unhappy with their lives growing up in the affluence. They were unsatisfied. They become depressed. They yearn for something different. And in their youth, they run away and go from one extreme, an extreme of luxury, to another of extreme minimalism and deprivation. And the name for that lifestyle of minimalism is asceticism. Mahavira became an ascetic. But that didn't lead to answers either. So eventually, he leaves a small group of monks, of minimalists, of ascetics, of ascetic monks, and he goes it alone. Siddhartha does this as well. One of the principles that he was practicing was called ahimsa, which means non-injury to all living creatures, regardless of whether it's a human being, a dog, a cat, or the smallest insect. All life is valuable. So many Jains, Hindus, and Buddhists are vegetarian and or vegan. Well, I guess and doesn't make sense. They're vegetarian or vegan. Mahavira became known for going to the utmost extremes in these ascetic practices. And there were a couple legends that are of particular note. One of them involves a group of travelers who see Mahavira meditating in the lotus pose, cross-legged, totally ignoring outside stimuli. And these travelers decide to put Mahavira to the test. They were with two dogs that were aggressive, and they let these dogs out on Mahavira and say, oh, we'll get him to break his trance. But even with the dogs barking and gnawing at him, the legend has that he remains unmoved and doesn't flinch. And then they up the ante and they say, we know how we can disturb this person's meditative practice. Let's light a fire beneath him. That will awaken him. And as the legend has, even with a fire burning underneath him, he remains calm, doesn't flinch. And after 12 years of these sorts of extreme practices, he finally releases himself from the cycle and achieves enlightenment, moksha. So here's what Mahavira might have looked like. If you didn't know any better, you might have thought that these were images of the Buddha. That's one of the meditative poses, with legs crossed. The term karma is very important for Jains. But unlike Hinduism, karma is predominantly or entirely a negative thing. You don't want to accumulate any karma. So the way to accomplish this is to do as little as possible. And the idea is, if you live minimalistically, you will avoid the sorts of predicaments and troubles that come along with a very active life. So think of it as a way to avoid the suffering that comes from unsatisfied desires by ensuring that you don't become tempted, by not putting yourself in situations of temptation. So if you know for a more contemporary example, if you know that you have a problem with food or not exercising, or drugs or alcohol, if you avoid those types of situations that tend to lead to those addicting substances or practices, then you'll be much better off. So karma in general is a bad thing, and the ideal life is one of a monk. So there are two sorts of substances in the world. Everything in the world is either jiva or ajiva. Jiva is one's soul, one's life. It's immaterial, non-physical, and it's good. Ajiva is the opposite. Instead of being a soul, it's made of a physical substance. It's made of matter. It's not life, it's lifeless. It's not immaterial, it's made of materials. Instead of good, it's evil. And who we are is housed and trapped in this physical body. And so the extreme practices that are done in Jainism are a way to release the soul from its encasement of the flesh, punishing the flesh as a way to free the soul. And if you think of the saying, sweating out a cold, that is particularly pertinent because you almost punish the body by exercising and beating the cold in that way. So this quote from Hirayana sums up that dualism between jiva and ajiva. Man's personality, as it is familiarly known, to us is dual. Dual as in two sorts, consisting of a spiritual, that's jiva, as well as a material element, that's the ajiva. The object of life is to subdue the latter. So the latter in this case is the material element, the body, the flesh, as to shake off its malignant influence. Malignant is bad influence, and thereby enable the jiva to reveal all its inherent excellences in their fullness. So that is the course or path to enlightenment. Mahavira ends up going it alone, and then and only then does he achieve release from samsara, the cycle of reincarnation. So the role of the gods is very much downplayed. Now, because Jainism has its roots in Hinduism, and Hinduism, as we know, worships many gods, millions of gods, there is not so much a denial of the god's existence. Some Jains will deny their existence, but it's more of a making a point of the gods not being needed. So they don't spend, the answer to this question is they do not spend a lot of time worshiping gods. You can achieve moksha as an individual. You can go it alone. In fact, that's the way to do it. Gods are not necessary. Prayer and worship as well are worthless. There's not really a creation story in Jainism because our true nature is spiritual, and that spirit has no beginning and no end. Thus, there's no need for a creator. We're going to talk about 5 principles in Jain ethics. The first we've already discussed, and that's ahimsa, the vow of non-injury to life. You will see some Jain monks wearing a mask to cover their mouth so as not to inhale a gnat. Remember, in parts of India, it can be very humid and there can be many insects. Sometimes they will also carry around a broom to sweep the path in front of them so as not to step on even the smallest insect. Many of them will live in urban places, live in cities, to avoid agriculture. So that's the first principle, ahimsa. The name of the sacred texts in Jainism are the agamas, and they're broken down into sections called sutras. So let's read from some of these texts. So these are translated into English. So this is how bad it is to hurt any sort of creature, whether it be a human, a dog, a cow, or a small insect. Injury to any of these creatures, injury to anything that lives on the earth, is like striking, cutting, maiming, or killing a blind man. So exploiting someone with a disability, everyone, even in the West, would admit that's a terrible thing to do. Well, it turns out that that's how bad it is to harm an innocent creature, no matter how small. Skip down to the bottom paragraph. All beings with 2, 3, 4, 5 senses, regardless of how sophisticated your physiology is and your biology, you have intrinsic value, and respect is owed to you as a creature. Second principle is about truth. So this is really a 2-pronged principle. The first aspect of it has to do with the command of essentially be honest. So principle number 1, non-injury, a vow to not harm any innocent creatures. Second principle, be honest. And the second prong of this second principle is about the nature of truth itself. So there's a parable about blind men, and each in Jainism, and each of these blind men is presented with an object in front of them, and they're told to describe it by touch alone. The first blind person touches the object and says, "It's a stone." The second one feels around and says, "I've got it, it's a rope." A third object is put in front of a third blind person, and this individual says, "It's a fan." Well, it turns out that they were all touching the same object, namely an elephant. The first person likely touching the side or the foot of the elephant, who thought it was a stone. The second likely was touching the tail, perhaps the trunk, but more likely the tail, who thought it was a rope. And the third probably was touching the ear, who thought it was a fan. So not everyone, no individual has the whole picture. We only have pieces. And so it will take a lifetime of living morally, living under these Jain codes, of living minimalistically. Through lifetimes of this, we can achieve enlightenment. And when we do, we take steps closer to the truth, to reality. So that's the second aspect of this Jain principle on truth. So you can pause and read that, but that essentially is the parable of the blind man and the elephant. Well, I'll just say each observer has only got part of the truth. Principle number 3, prohibition on stealing. Don't take anything that's not given to you. So many Jain monks in the past, some today, will go around with almost no possessions, carrying a bowl, and they would go from village to village, and they would exchange their wisdom, their teaching, in exchange for food or robes. We see this in Buddhism too. But in general, it's about not stealing. Number 4, renouncing sexual pleasures. Number 5 is renouncing attachments in general. Now, you might think, how could someone get married, have children, and have a family, and uphold all these principles? And the answer is it would be difficult or impossible. So it turns out that only Jain monks who do not have families, they're the ones that will strive to uphold all 5. Most Jains, kind of your ordinary Jain, if you will do their best to uphold the first 3. They'll be not harming creatures, be honest, not steal, but they'll break the 4th and 5th because they'll have attachments to their families and sexual pleasure with their spouses. There are some conservative Jains that will say, because of 4 and 5, certain members will never be able to achieve enlightenment. And it was thought for a long time that women were not allowed. So we're going to talk about some of the Jain sects, so which of them had this more conservative view and which didn't. Well, here's the first sect that was actually more liberal, and they're called the Svetambara. Svetambara. And that translates to white clad. And that has to do with what they would wear. Clad is about clothing. So white clad means wearing white clothing. So they'd wear white robes. They were mostly in northern India, and they believed that women could achieve release. And not surprisingly, because they were liberal, they had more followers. In terms of numbers, more members of Jainism are of this particular stripe, Svetambara. So here's a depiction of what they might look like, and you see the white clad, the white robes, you see the mask, and the broom there. Next up, we have the Digambara. So that means sky-clad. That's the more conservative sect. So instead of northern India, you find them predominantly in the south. And instead of wearing white garments, they wear nothing. So sky-clad isn't wearing robes that are sky blue, but wearing the sky, if you will, wearing nothing. And in this tradition, this conservative sect of Jainism, women are believed to not be able to achieve moksha, and they serve as hindrances. And some of them believe that Mahavira was not married and had a child, that he went alone without having a family. So here's an image of some of the Digambara monks, and you can see that they're carrying brooms. And perhaps some of the white-clad monks are surrounding them out of respect. So there's not much more that I want to tell you about Jainism, just a little bit about their temples and some of their symbology. Now, you might see a little bit of inconsistency between what I said about Jain minimalism and these beautiful, elaborate temples, Jain temples. And so my response would be that we often see inconsistency between what a religion preaches and what is practiced. So the saying, you should practice what you preach, is not always upheld. Think about how Catholics have an inconsistency when it comes to the structures of their churches. They can be very elaborate and tall, steeples, stained glass windows. Think about the ornateness of the Vatican. That's not really in line with the minimalist message that was advanced by Christ. So it's really the same story here. We're going to talk about two symbols in Jainism, and that'll be it. So this first one, you can see that hand and the text in the middle. Both of those together, and really the whole symbol, means a halting. And it's a halting of that blue wheel. The wheel is the cycle of samsara, of reincarnation. So that's what you want to end. You want that to cease. So the name of that wheel is the Dharma Chakra, and it represents the endless or the near endless cycle of reincarnation. And that text in the middle means ahimsa. So one of the ways that you can end the cycle is through their number one principle of ahimsa. And finally, we have this symbol that you see often in Jainism, and that's the swastika. Notice it's facing right, meaning that it's associated with a good symbol as opposed to the mirror image of it over the, I guess that would be the y-axis. If you did a symmetrical flip mirroring of that, then you would have it facing left, which can be an unlucky symbol. So that you see all these colors and dots, so let me explain what those are. Well, first off, the red swastika itself kind of looks like a wheel, maybe like a pinwheel, and that represents samsara, the cycle, and you want to break free of it. So the yellow region that's separated by that curve, that's enlightenment. So you want to free yourself from the red part, the cycle, and get to moksha, enlightenment. And the way that you do that is crossing this green barrier of these three dots, and that represents your the methodology of how you would achieve enlightenment. So the first dot represents right faith, the second right knowledge, and the third right conduct. And the four blue dots are about the sort of beings that exist in the world. So the first are heavenly beings, the second are humans, human beings, the third animal beings, and the fourth hellish beings. So those are the sorts of beings that have to live their lives in the cycle. And then when you finally get the closest to enlightenment, you the heavenly being is the one that is the closest, or it finally gets out. And all the others, they're lower on the ladder of sorts of beings. Okay, that's it for Jainism. I hope that was clear and that you now feel like you have a basic understanding, at the least, of this tradition known as Jainism.